I'm never going to go camping in Maine again. Although Maine is a beautiful state, and don't get me wrong, it's incredibly beautiful, I just hate everything about it. Things happen here that can't be explained, and really don't follow any sort of real-world explanation. Maine has a beautiful fall, and along with my girlfriend, my best friend and his girlfriend, I decided that we should go camping up in Maine and check out the leaves changing. It was a great idea, at first anyway. A few days in the Maine wilderness couldn't hurt anybody, right? We made our plans, packed our bags, and headed up to a campsite near a small town in Maine. Baileyville, I think it was called. Once we got there and set up our tents, we decided to go for a hike in the woods. With the tent up and our bags left behind, we set off among the woods. It was beautiful there. The trees were starting to change colour and the air was crisp. We hiked for a few hours, taking in the sights and sounds of the nature. As we walked, the sun slowly started to dip below the horizon. We realised that we'd been hiking for a lot longer than we had thought and decided to turn back. The trail was getting harder to follow in the dark, and we did not want to get lost. Pulling out his flashlight, Jason, that's my best friend, led the way back. After a few minutes of walking, we came across something strange. "What the heck?" I heard my girlfriend gasp, and I turned to see what she was looking at. Lying in the middle of the trail was a dead deer. It looked like it had been killed recently, and there was blood everywhere. Its throat had been split open, and its eyes were missing. The cuts on the body of this animal weren't just normal. They were normal if you were a butcher maybe, or a surgeon, but not for an animal in the wild. The cuts were surgical, and they were too perfect to have been made by an animal. We stood there in shock for a few moments, not knowing what to do. What was the protocol when a hunter was in the woods with you? Didn't we need some sort of yellow vest or something so they wouldn't just shoot us on accident? That's what we thought at first, and admittedly we thought that it was a hunter who had done this to the deer. Foolish, right? And then we heard it. A branch snapped in the distance, and we all turned towards the sound. Jason shone his flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. No animals, no people, just trees. "Hello?" I called out, half hoping that a hunter would answer, and the other half hoping that nobody would. There was no response, apart from the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. We stood there for a few moments longer, not knowing what to do. And then, as if on cue, we all turned and began walking back towards the campsite. We didn't say a word to each other, but we all knew we wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. When we got back to the campsite, we didn't say a word about what had happened. We all pretended like nothing was wrong, like we hadn't seen anything strange in the woods. But we all knew that something was definitely wrong. We went to bed early that night, and I couldn't sleep. I laid there awake, staring up at the top of the tent, listening to the sounds of the woods around us. And then I heard it. A branch snapped. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I slowly turned my head to look at my girlfriend, who was still asleep. A bit of context, she's always been a sleep talker, and could murmur in her sleep quite loudly at times. I found it cute, and it never bothered me. But that night, it really bothered me. At just that moment, she let out a bit of a murmur in her sleep, a pretty loud one too. Okay, so that wasn't what bothered me. It was the murmur in response that came from directly outside our tent. I slowly turned my head to look at the tent flap, and my heart nearly stopped. There was somebody, or something, outside. I could see that from the shadow in front of the flap, that somebody was definitely standing there. My girlfriend murmured again in her sleep, and the shadow outside the tent returned the noise. I was frozen in fear, and I couldn't move. I felt an icy cold sweat on my forehead, and I could hear my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything. And finally, I did. "Who the hell is out there?" I yelled, lunging for the tent flap. I ripped it open and leaped outside. But there was nobody there. No sign of anybody at all. I shunned my flashlight around, but there was nothing. No footprints, no animals, no people. Just trees. I stood there for a few moments, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. Jason emerged from his tent looking confused. "What's going on?" he asked. I shook my head, not knowing how to explain it. I don't know. I thought I heard something. We both stood there in silence for a few moments. And then, we heard it again, that same branch snapping sound coming from the woods. Jason shone his flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. No animals, no people, just trees. As I glanced back at Jason, though, I realized his attention wasn't on the woods any longer. It had been directed to the ground in front of him. I followed his gaze. My heart nearly stopped. There, in the dirt, were several dead rabbits. Their throats had been slit open, and their eyes were missing. The cuts on their bodies were surgical, and they were too perfect to have been made by an animal, just like the deer that we had seen earlier. We both stood there in silence for a few moments, not knowing what to say or what to do, and then we heard it again. That same branch snapping sound coming from the woods, but this time it sounded closer. Just outside of the range of our lights, there came a voice. A woman's voice was soft and sweet. "Help me," she called out. Jason and I both turned towards the sound of the noise, and I recognized it. It was my girlfriend's voice, and I almost ran out into the woods to find her. But Jason grabbed my arm, and I turned around toward my tent to see my girlfriend emerging sleepily from inside. "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. I don't know," I stammered, not knowing how to explain it. We all stood there in silence for a few moments, not knowing what to do or say. And then we heard it again, my girlfriend's voice coming from the woods. "Help me," she called out again. My girlfriend's face was pale, and she was shaking. I could see the fear in her eyes, and I knew that she had heard it too. "We need to get the hell out of here," Jason said, and I nodded. We began grabbing our things, and Jason woke his girlfriend. As we took down the tents, however, I heard a freaky scream from my girlfriend as she stumbled backward violently, clawing her arms at her body to fend off something which had fallen from the sky. Running towards her, I saw the source of her terror. In front of her, the dead body of a crow had fallen from the sky and landed at her feet. Just like the deer and the rabbits, its throat had been slit open, and its eyes were missing. It was perfect in every manner, and identical to the other animals. As we stared at the bird on the ground, I heard gentle falling noises around us, as if leaves were raining down from the sky. I looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. All around us, several other crows were falling. Their blood hit the ground as their lifeless bodies piled up. My girlfriend screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her down the road to our car. Jason and his girlfriend were several feet in front of us, and they were already running to the car. We all piled in, and Jason peeled out of the campsite as fast as he could. Driving down the road, we sat in the car in complete silence. "I need some noise," Jason finally spoke, and turned the radio on as he did. That was a mistake. From the radio, a voice echoed as a singular sentence was repeated over and over. The voice sounded just like my girlfriend's. "Help me." Staring at the radio in horror, you can imagine it didn't take us long to turn it off. As we reached the fork in the road where you turn out of the campsite, we finally saw them. I'm assuming they were the ones responsible for all of this, and to this day, I don't know why they let us go. Standing in the road were three figures, cloaked in black from head to toe. Their faces were hidden in the shadows of their hoods, but their hands were stretched forward in an outward gesture, almost as if they were saluting. Each one held the tail of a cat in their hand with the other, and as we drove I saw that there were dozens of them gathered around the road. Each held a different animal. Only the 3 figures standing in the road held the cats. Each dead animal, however, made it abundantly clear what they were doing there. Perfectly slit throats with the eyes removed. A ritualistic cult of some sort engaged in animal sacrifice. Jason hesitated as he drove towards the 3 figures in the road, unsure whether or not to go around them. "Don't stop," I whispered, but as I said it, one of the figures in the road stepped forward, and he didn't. Revving up the engine, Jason floored it and we drove right towards them. As we drove, they stepped, or glided, as it seemed from their robes, out of the road and stood by, allowing us to pass. As we did, though, I got a glance into their eyes. Every eye was inhuman in one way, yet equally human in another. There was no sclera, only the iris and the pupil. The corneas were black as coal, as if they'd been burned out a long time ago. The overall effect was intensely disconcerting, and I turned away as fast as I could. The image, however, remained burned into my mind, and as we drove down the road, I couldn't help but get the feeling that we were being watched. And as we turned out of that campsite, I swore I saw one of them step out from the woods and watch us drive away. We drove for several towns and finally reached a larger city. We got a hotel room and tried to forget about what had happened, but that was impossible. Each of us had seen something different in those figures' eyes, and it was as if we were all dealing with our own personal nightmares. I'm never going to go camping in Maine again. I don't care how beautiful the leaves are. All I know is that somewhere deep in those Maine woods, there are things happening that can't be explained. Things that are best left forgotten. I don't know if it was some crazy cult ritual, some animal sacrifice, or maybe something even more sinister. But whatever it was, I never want to see it again. Despite this, I can't help but have a burning sense of curiosity as to what those figures were doing out in the woods and why they let us go. I know they could have stopped us or held us back or even killed us, but they didn't, and that's what terrifies me the most. I broke up with my girlfriend soon after that. Although I couldn't be sure, she always seemed different since we came back. Maybe it was because of the freaky, traumatizing event that had taken place, or maybe something else. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had changed. Maybe, and this is why I couldn't stand being with her any longer, maybe she was still in those Maine woods, calling for my help. Maybe whatever came back with me from the trip wasn't my girlfriend.